She was 22 years old, standing in her father's kitchen, listening to him sell her. Not her labor, not her land, her. The man across the table had yellow teeth and patient eyes, the kind of patience that came from knowing he always got what he wanted. Her father's hand shook as he pushed the signed paper across the wood. A debt cleared, a daughter delivered. As simple as settling a horse trade. Avery Callahan did not scream. She did not beg. She stood very still and understood, for the first time in her life, exactly what she had always been worth to the people who were supposed to love her. Nothing. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the very last word. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let me see just how far this story has traveled. The trouble with Frank Callahan was that he had always believed his luck was about to change. That was the thing Avery had spent 22 years trying to understand about her father. Not the drinking, not the gambling, not the string of bad decisions that stretched back further than she could remember. Those were symptoms. The disease was the belief. The unshakable, bone-deep conviction that the next hand would be the one that turned everything around. That the cards were simply waiting for the right moment to reward him for his patience. They never did. They never would. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Avery had known that for a long time. She just hadn't known how badly he would burn everything down when the luck finally ran out for good. It was a Tuesday in late October when she came home to find Dale Whitmore's wagon parked outside the house. She had been working since before sunrise, 3 miles down the road at the Hendersons' farm, doing washing and mending for 50 cents a day, which was not much but was honest and was hers. Her hands were raw from the lye soap, and her back ached from bending over the washboard, and she was thinking about nothing more complicated than getting her boots off and eating whatever was left in the pot from the night before. Then she saw the wagon. It was a big rig, well-maintained, the kind of wagon that belonged to a man who had money and wanted people to know it. 2 bay horses stood hitched at the post, stamping against the cold, their breath making small clouds in the gray afternoon air. Avery stopped walking. Something in her chest went tight and still, the way it always did when she came home to something she hadn't been expecting. She had learned, early, that unexpected things at the Callahan house were rarely good. She pushed open the front door without knocking. It was her house, too, or had been once, before her father's second marriage had made everything complicated, and found them in the kitchen. Her father sat at the table with his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over in his fingers the way he did when he was nervous. Her stepmother, Cora, stood by the stove with her back turned, which meant she already knew what was being said and didn't want to be held responsible for her expression. And Dale Whitmore sat in the chair that used to be her mother's, his thick forearms resting on the table, looking entirely at ease in a way that made Avery's stomach turn. I was 53 years old, with a rancher's weathered face and small, careful eyes the color of dirty water. He owned 1,200 acres 20 miles east of town, and he had been married twice, both times to women who had come to him with limited options. And both times those women had ended up leaving the territory quietly, without explanation, within 3 years. Nobody talked about it directly, but people knew. The way people on the frontier always knew things they were too uncomfortable to say aloud. "There she is," Whitmore said, when Avery stepped through the door. He didn't stand. He just looked at her with those pale, patient eyes, and the corner of his mouth moved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Frank said you'd be back around now." Avery looked at her father. "What's going on?" Frank Callahan didn't meet her eyes. His hands kept working the hat brim. "Sit down, Avery." "I'd rather stand." "Sit down." She pulled out a chair and sat, because she had learned that some fights weren't worth having before you understood what you were fighting about. She kept her coat on. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. It took her father the better part of 10 minutes to get to the point, and the route he took was the one he always took, starting with the circumstances, moving to the pressures, stopping twice to explain that he hadn't had a choice, that things had gotten complicated, that anyone in his position would have done the same thing. He talked about the drought and the cattle prices and the loan that had come due 6 weeks before he expected. He talked about the poker game in Tulsa that was supposed to fix everything. He talked, and he talked, and he did not once look his daughter in the face. Avery understood what was happening before he finished saying it. She understood it the way she understood things about her father, not through what he said, but through the shape of what he was avoiding. "How much?" she said. Her father blinked. "What?" "How much do you owe him?" a beat of silence. Whitmore picked up his coffee cup with 2 fingers, unhurried. $460, he said, plus interest. He said it like he was reading a figure from a ledger. Mild. Factual. Like the number hadn't just landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. And you're going to clear the debt, Avery said slowly. How exactly? Her father's jaw worked. The hat brim turned. Cora's shoulders, at the stove, went up a half-inch. Nobody said anything. Avery looked at Whitmore. He looked back at her. He set his coffee cup down and spread his hands on the table, palms up, like a man with nothing to hide. It was the gesture of a man who had done this before and knew that patience was the only thing he needed. Your father proposed an arrangement, Whitmore said. You'd come out to my ranch, keep house, company. He paused. We'd make it legal, if that's the word you want. Marriage. Or something close enough. Something close enough, she repeated. Avery, her father started. Don't. The word came out flat and quiet, and it stopped him cold. She stood up from the chair. Her legs felt strange, steady, which surprised her because the rest of her felt like the ground had just shifted sideways beneath her feet. You sold me. It's not like that. You signed a paper. You gave him, what, an agreement? A promise? She looked at Whitmore again. Is there a paper? There is, he said. And if I refuse? The patience in his eyes didn't change. That was the worst part of it. The absence of any flicker of doubt, any concern that she might say no and mean it. He had the kind of certainty that came from a lifetime of owning things. Your father would owe the debt in cash, which he doesn't have. He tilted his head slightly. The law has opinions about debts. The law also has opinions about women being traded for them. Something moved in his expression then. Not anger, not even irritation, more like mild amusement. The expression of a man who finds a colt's resistance entertaining because he knows how it ends. Nobody's trading you for anything. It's a voluntary arrangement. Your father agrees to the terms. You agree to the terms. He paused. That's all. She looked at her father one last time. Frank Callahan was staring at the table. His hands had gone still on the hat brim, finally. He looked old. He looked for the first time in her life like what he actually was. A man who had made 1,000 small decisions that all pointed in the same direction, and had arrived, at last, at the place they had been taking him all along. She had loved him once, she thought. She still wasn't sure when she'd stopped. I need air, she said. She walked out the door. She stood in the yard for a long time, her breath clouding in the cold, her hands shoved in her coat pockets. The afternoon light was going gray and thin, the way it did in late October in Oklahoma. A flattening of the sky that made everything look like it was happening behind dirty glass. The 2 bay horses shifted at the post. Somewhere down the road, a dog was barking at something it couldn't reach. She thought about the options because that was what she did when things got bad. She made herself look at them straight. She could refuse. She could walk back into that kitchen and say no. And her father's debt would stay her father's debt, and the law would come for him eventually. Or Whitmore's men would, which might be worse. That would mean watching everything collapse, and it would mean that Whitmore would find another angle. He seemed like a man who enjoyed finding angles. She could run. She had a little money saved, just under $12 hidden in the lining of her winter coat. $12 and the clothes she was wearing and no horse. She didn't know anyone in the next county well enough to ask for help. She didn't know anyone anywhere well enough to ask for help. That was the thing about growing up the way she had. You learned not to form attachments that could be used against you. She could give in. She could be practical. She could tell herself that plenty of women had done worse and survived. She could look at Whitmore's 1,200 acres and his maintained wagon and his patience and tell herself that this was just a trade, and trades were survivable if you kept your head down and your expectations low. She had been keeping her expectations low her whole life. She was very tired of it. She was still standing in the yard, turning none of this over to any conclusion, when she heard the second wagon coming. Tut. She heard it before she saw it. The sound of a team moving at a steady, unhurried pace on the dirt road that ran past the Callahan property. She turned, not because she was expecting anything, just because a sound was something to look at when your thoughts had run themselves into a ditch. The wagon that came around the bend was a working rig. Not fancy, but solid, the kind of thing built to cover distance without falling apart. 2 black horses pulling it. And on the bench, a man she didn't recognize. He would have been around 40, she thought, though it was hard to tell with men who'd spent their lives outdoors. The sun aged some of them fast and others barely at all, and this one looked like he'd simply arrived at a certain point and stopped there. Broad through the shoulders, trail-worn jacket, a hat pulled low against the wind. He had a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 3 or 4 days, and hands on the reins that were the hands of someone who'd used them for actual work. I wasn't looking at her, not at first. He was looking at the road, and then at the wagon post. And then he pulled his team to an easy stop and set the brake, and looked at the yard the way a man looks at a place he's been to before, checking to see if anything's changed. His eyes moved to her. They were dark and steady and gave nothing away. "This the Callahan place?" he said. "Who's asking?" "Silas Reed." The name didn't mean anything to her. "It is." He nodded once, like that settled something. He didn't move to get down. "Frank Callahan home?" "He's inside," she said. Then, because she was tired and frustrated and the day had already exceeded its quota for things she hadn't wanted to deal with, she said, "If you're here about a debt, there's a line." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the edge of one. "I'll keep that in mind." He climbed down from the wagon, moved with the ease of a man comfortable in his own body, and stopped a few feet from her. Close enough to talk, far enough to be respectful about it, which she noticed. "You're the daughter." "Avery?" "Silas Reed." He said it again, like he understood the first time hadn't landed and was offering her another chance to place the name. "You said that already." "I did." He glanced toward the house. "He expecting me?" "I don't know what he's expecting. He's been full of surprises today." That almost smile again. "Mind if I go in?" "It's his house," she said, "or it will be until the bank figures out otherwise." She wasn't sure why she'd said that last part. She didn't usually talk to strangers about the state of things. But there was something about the directness of him, the absence of performance, of the false ease that Whitmore had brought into that kitchen, that made the words come out without calculation. He looked at her for a moment. Not the way Whitmore had looked at her, more like he was listening to something she hadn't quite said. "An interesting day then," he said. "You could say that." He went inside. She didn't go back in. She stayed in the yard and listened to the wind and the dog and the distant sound of voices from inside the house, none of it distinct enough to follow. The bay horses and the black horses stood at the post together, not touching, maintaining the casual distance of animals that had never met. 20 minutes passed. Maybe 30. She had lost her interest in tracking time. Then the front door opened and Whitmore came out. He wasn't moving the way he'd moved coming in, that slow, settled certainty. He was moving faster, and his face had a closed-up look to it, the expression of a man who has decided that discretion is the better part of something. He went to his horses. He unhitched them without looking at Avery. He climbed up to his bench. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. He looked at her. The pale eyes were flat now, the patience drained out of them, replaced by something cooler. "This isn't finished," he said. "What isn't?" But he was already turning his horses, and then he was moving down the road, and then the wagon was rounding the bend and gone. Avery stood very still. After a moment, she turned and went inside. Silas Reed was sitting at the kitchen table in the chair that Whitmore had occupied 20 minutes earlier, and the difference between how each man sat in it was considerable. He sat like someone who had come to accomplish a specific thing and had accomplished it. Her father was still at the table, but he'd pushed his chair back, and the hat was on the table now, and he looked like a man who'd just been hit with something large and soft, confused, more than hurt, still figuring out which direction the impact had come from. Cora had left the kitchen entirely. Avery looked at Silas Reed. "What did you do?" "Paid a debt," he said. He had a document on the table in front of him, folded once. He pushed it toward her. "Your name's on it." She looked at her father. "My name's on what exactly?" Frank Callahan rubbed his face. "He bought the note," he said. "The debt. It's his now." A pause. "Along with the other part." "The other part," she said. "The arrangement." Her father's voice had gone small. "With Whitmore. Reed here says he bought that too." Avery picked up the document. She unfolded it and read it, because she had taught herself to read when she was 7 years old using her mother's Bible and a McGuffey primer, and she was careful about documents, had been since she was old enough to understand that the words in them were the things that actually mattered. She read it twice. Then she set it back on the table and looked at Silas Reed. "This says the debt is cleared," she said, "and it says the arrangement is transferred to you." "It does, which means you're claiming the same thing Whitmore was claiming." "No." He said it plainly, without any edge to it. "It means I own the paper, not you." He paused. "I'm not Whitmore." "I don't know what you are." "Fair enough." He leaned back in the chair, arms loose, not crowding anything. "I have a ranch, 60 miles northeast, Broken Creek Valley. I need capable people. You want work and a place to land that isn't here or with Whitmore. I can offer that." Another pause. "Wages. Your own room. Nothing asked that you're not willing to give. And if you decide in a week or a month that you'd rather be somewhere else, you ride out. No paper holds you." Avery looked at him for a long time. She was not naive. She had not survived 22 years of Frank Callahan's household by being naive. She knew that men offered things with one hand and held something else behind their back with the other. She knew that safety could be its own kind of trap, that protection came in shapes that looked like cages. She also knew that Dale Whitmore had driven away, and that Silas Reed had made that happen, and that the document on the table transferred nothing she had to do anything about unless she chose to. "Why?" she said. "You don't know me." Something passed through his expression that she couldn't quite name. Not sentiment. More like recognition of a question he'd expected. "I knew a woman once who had a version of this happen to her," he said. "Turned out different." He didn't elaborate. He didn't look like a man who elaborated much. She pulled the document back toward her and read the third line again. "Debt satisfied in full. No further claim on persons or property of the Callahan household." She looked at her father. He was looking at his hat. "You're fine with this," she said to him. "You're fine with a stranger buying me out of one deal and offering me another." Frank Callahan lifted his eyes to her face, finally. What she saw there was not guilt, exactly. It was something more complicated and less useful. The expression of a man who knows he's done wrong but has already forgiven himself for it, and is waiting for the people around him to do the same. "You'd be taken care of," he said. "Safer than here." The word safer sat in the air between them. She thought about $12 in her coat lining. She thought about Dale Whitmore's patient eyes. She thought about the 3 years her mother had spent married to Frank Callahan and dying slowly in this kitchen, loving a man who was always about to turn his luck around. She picked up the document and folded it, put it in her coat pocket. "I'll need an hour," she said to Reed. "I don't have much, but I'll pack what I have." He nodded, nothing excessive about it. "I'll wait." She left the kitchen without saying anything else to her father. She wasn't sure she had anything left to say to him that would have done either of them any good. Her room was small and had been smaller, in her mind, every year she'd lived in it, not because it had shrunk, but because she had grown, and the growth had a way of making the walls feel closer. She had a bed, a chair, a trunk, and a window that looked east. She had 3 dresses, 2 work shirts, 1 good pair of boots, and 1 pair held together with determination and a piece of wire. She had her mother's hairbrush, which she took without thinking. She had a folder of papers in the bottom of the trunk, her birth certificate, 2 receipts for wages she'd earned and collected, a letter from a school teacher in Muskogee who had once told her she was smart and ought to find a way to use it. She packed it all in 25 minutes. She came back through the kitchen without stopping. Cora was there again, standing at the stove, stirring something that didn't need stirring. Avery did not say goodbye to her. They had never pretended to be family, and she saw no reason to start now. Her father was in the front room. He'd moved from the kitchen at some point, and now he was sitting in his chair by the window, looking out at the yard where Reed was leaning against his wagon, waiting the way he'd said he would. "Avery," her father said. She stopped. "I'm sorry," he said. She stood there for a moment with her trunk under one arm and her mother's hairbrush in her coat pocket and the document with her name on it folded against her ribs. She thought about what she could say. She thought about 22 years of dinners and harvests and winters and the particular loneliness of being raised by someone who loved you the way they loved their luck. In theory, passionately, without follow-through. "I know you are," she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It was just true. She walked out the door. The road north was rutted and cold, and the wind had picked up by the time they cleared town. Avery sat on the bench beside Reed with her trunk in the wagon bed and her hands in her lap, watching the land open up around them the way it did when you got north of the flat crop country, the terrain starting to fold and break, The grass going longer, the sky doing the thing it did out here where it stopped being a ceiling and started being a presence. They didn't talk much at first. She was not in the mood for talk, and he didn't seem to require it, which she appreciated. He drove the team with the quiet competence of someone who'd covered many miles in many conditions and found nothing remarkable about any of it. After an hour, she said, "How big is the ranch?" 800 acres in the valley, another 300 in the high pasture. Cattle? Primarily. Some horses. He paused. A kitchen garden that's been badly neglected. 3 permanent hands and a cook who leaves for his sisters in Kansas City every winter, which is inconvenient. What do you need that you're short of? He glanced at her. Someone who can look at a problem and think past the obvious solution. She wasn't sure if that was a job description or something else. I know horses, she said. Cattle, some. I can mend and cook, and I'm stronger than I look. I know. You don't know anything about me. I know you read that document twice and knew what line to question, he said. And I know you walked out of that house with your spine straight and your chin level. That tells me something. She looked at the road ahead. The light was failing toward evening, the sky going that deep cold blue that came before dark out here. It tells you I'm not going to fall apart on you. It tells me you're someone who pays attention, he said. That's rarer than strong. She thought about that. After a while, she said, What happened to the woman, the one you mentioned? Who had the same thing happen? His hands didn't change on the reins, but something in his shoulders did. A small shift, a tightening, that released again quickly. She didn't have anyone to pay the note, he said. She went with the man who held it. It didn't go well. Avery didn't push. The way he'd said it closed the door firmly enough. She was someone you cared about, she said. Not a question. My sister, he said. After a moment, she got out eventually. Took 4 years. Another pause. I should have moved faster. The road stretched out ahead of them, gray and long in the failing light. Somewhere in the distance, the land was rising toward hills she couldn't see yet. I don't need a rescuer, she said. I want to be clear about that. I heard you the first time, he said. I'm offering work. What you do with it is your own. And if I decide the work isn't worth staying for, then you ride out, he said, same as I told you before. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. The black horses moved at their steady pace. The sky deepened toward night, and the first stars appeared over the eastern horizon, cold and clear and very far away. She did not feel safe, exactly. She wasn't sure she believed in safe, the way some people seemed to. But she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she was moving in a direction she had chosen rather than one she'd been pointed toward. That was something. She watched the road and the horses and the slow darkening of the sky and held the thought like she'd once held her mother's hand, carefully, with both hands, not squeezing too hard, just keeping it close. They made camp when the dark got serious. Not a town, not a ranch, just a flat section of ground beside a creek that Reed clearly knew because he pulled off the road with the certainty of someone who had stopped here before. He knew where the wood was, or at least where to find it quickly, and had a fire going with the kind of minimal efficiency that came from long practice, not showmanship. He mud coffee. He had food in a tin box in the wagon bed, salt pork, hard bread, dried apples that had seen better days. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He just handed her a portion and poured 2 cups and left hers where she could reach it. She ate. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite, which was the way hunger sometimes worked when the rest of the day had demanded more attention. They sat on opposite sides of the fire. The horses were picketed behind them, pulling at the creek grass with the satisfied sounds of animals that had earned their rest. You do this often? She said. By debts. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. No. Just whenever it seems warranted? I was in Tulsa on business. I heard Whitmore talking about an arrangement he was about to finalize. I knew enough about him to know what that meant. He looked into the fire for a moment. I've been trying to move faster than I did before. When it matters. You don't know if I was worth it yet. No, he agreed. Neither do you. She looked at him across the fire. The light made his face harder to read, all shadow and flicker. But what she could see of it was straightforward. No performance of generosity. No waiting for her to acknowledge what he'd done. He'd said what he'd said, and he seemed content to leave it there. Tell me about the ranch, she said. Broken Creek Valley. And he did, with the same spare directness he brought to everything, the geography of it, the way the valley ran north to south with the creek feeding the west pasture, the winter that had been hard 2 years running and taken a toll on the herd, the fence line on the north ridge that needed replacing before spring. He talked about it the way a man talked about a thing he was responsible for and took seriously. She listened and asked questions, real ones, about drainage and grazing rotation and where the water table was reliable and where it wasn't. He answered them all without surprise, which she noticed and filed away. The fire burned down. The night got cold and proper. She wrapped herself in the blanket he'd pulled from the wagon without ceremony and laid it across the fire from her, and she slept better than she had in months. Not well, exactly. Her back ached and the ground was hard, and she woke twice from dreams she couldn't hold. But there was no one in the next room whose decisions were about to land on her in the morning. There was no paper with her name on it going in a direction she hadn't chosen. She lay in the dark and listened to the creek and the horses and the distant sound of something, a coyote, maybe. And she thought about Whitmore's patient eyes and her father's hat turning in his hands, and the way the document had sat on the table with her name in it like a thing that had already been decided. She thought about the $12 in her coat lining, still there, still hers. She thought about a woman named something Reed who had taken 4 years to get out. She thought about speed and about choices and about the difference between surviving something and deciding something. She did not have a plan. She had a direction, and she had enough intelligence to know they were not the same thing. But the direction was north, and it was her own. And for now, in the dark with the creek running and the stars overhead and nothing decided yet about what the valley would turn out to be. For now, that was enough. Broken Creek Valley came into view on the second afternoon, and it was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected, given that she'd been building the picture from Silas Reed's spare descriptions and the long silences between them. What she saw was this: a valley that ran between two low ridges the color of old rust, maybe 3 miles wide at its broadest point, with a creek threading down the western edge, through a stand of cottonwoods that had gone gold and thin with the season. The grass in the bottomland was long and pale, flattened in places by wind or cattle, and the sky above it was the particular wide, indifferent blue of late autumn in the territory, the kind of sky that made human concerns feel very small and very temporary. The main house sat on a rise above the creek, not large but solid. Stone foundation, timber frame, a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. Behind it, the barn was bigger than the house, which told her something about priorities. There were pens, a smokehouse, a bunkhouse set back from the main buildings at a respectful distance, and a kitchen garden that was exactly as neglected as Reed had said, a ragged square of dead growth and broken-down fence that looked like it had given up sometime in August and hadn't been argued with since. 3 men came out of the barn as the wagon pulled into the yard. They looked at Reed and then at Avery with the calibrated absence of expression that ranch hands used when they were paying close attention. "Tom, Charlie, Dix." Reed set the brake and climbed down. "This is Avery Callahan. She'll be working the ranch. Her room's the east one." Tom was the oldest, maybe 50, with a gray beard and the careful eyes of a man who'd seen enough changes of management to withhold judgment. Charlie was younger, wide through the chest, with a face that was trying hard not to show curiosity and not entirely succeeding. Dix was barely 20, and he wasn't trying to hide anything. He just looked at Avery with the open, uncomplicated assessment of someone who hadn't yet learned that people could be offended by being looked at directly. "Ma'am," Tom said, finally. "I'm not much for ma'am," Avery said. "Avery's fine." Tom's expression shifted 1 degree toward something warmer. Not a smile. More like the recognition of a statement that meant something. "Avery, then." Reed carried her trunk inside himself, which she noticed he did without comment, and without waiting to see if she'd stop him. She let him, because the alternative was a performance of independence that the situation didn't require. The east room was at the back of the house, off the narrow hallway that ran past the kitchen. It was small, smaller than her room at home, which she hadn't thought possible. With a single window facing east, a bed with an iron frame, a washstand, and a hook on the back of the door. Clean, plain, nothing decorative about it, the kind of room that had been used for sleeping and nothing else. Reed set her trunk at the foot of the bed. He pulled a key from his vest pocket and set it on the washstand. "Lock's on the inside," he said. "Only key." She looked at it. A small iron key, the kind that looked like it had come with the house and been kept in a drawer somewhere for years, waiting to be needed. She picked it up. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said. He was already turning toward the door. "Read?" He stopped. "Thank you," she said. It came out more direct than she'd intended, without the careful nothing that she usually wrapped around words that cost something to say. He nodded once. Then he went out and pulled the door shut behind him, and she heard his footsteps going down the hall and into the kitchen, and then quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was straw, which she'd expected, and the blanket folded at the foot of it was wool, thick and not new, but clean. She held the key in both hands and looked at the door. A lock on the inside. Her own key. She had never had either of those things before. Not in her father's house. Not in the rooms she'd occasionally rented in town when she had enough saved to spend a night away from Frank Callahan's particular form of chaos. Doors she'd slept behind had been doors other people could open if they chose to. She didn't cry about it. She wasn't built for that kind of sentiment. But she sat there for a longer moment than she would have admitted to, holding the key, before she got up and started unpacking her trunk. The first week was hard in the way that new things were always hard. Not dangerous, just unfamiliar. Every task requiring more concentration than it would once she knew the particular logic of this place. She learned the ranch the way she learned most things, by doing and by watching, and by asking questions when the alternative was making an avoidable mistake. Tom was the one who taught her most of it. He'd worked Broken Creek for 11 years and knew every fence post and water source and weather pattern with the quiet authority of a man whose knowledge was built from repetition rather than study. He wasn't warm, exactly, but he was patient with questions, which mattered more. "That gate on the south pen sticks," he told her, on the third morning, when she'd spent 4 minutes fighting it. "Lift and push at the same time. Reed's been meaning to fix it for 2 seasons. Does he fix things when he means to?" Tom considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Some things," he said. "He let that garden go to ruin, though. So." "I noticed. Had a woman helping in the house last year and the one before. Left both times." He paused, and the pause had a particular texture to it, like he was deciding how much was appropriate to say. Not because of anything Reed did, just the isolation and the winters. Not everyone's made for it. Avery looked at the dead garden. "What grew in it?" "Beans, some squash. Cook grew tomatoes near the house wall where it was warmer." Tom pushed his hat back on his head. "You know gardens?" "Some. My mother did. I watched enough to have a sense of it." "Spring planting's a ways off yet." He said it neutrally, the way a man said something that could be taken either as information or as a question about whether she'd still be there to do it. She chose to take it as information. "I'll look at the fence before then. It doesn't look complicated." Tom grunted. It was, she was beginning to understand, his version of approval. The work itself she didn't mind. The physical part of it, the kind that left her tired in the muscles rather than the soul. She helped Charlie with the morning feeding, learned the temperament of each animal in the pen, helped Dix mend a stretch of fence on the west boundary that had gone down sometime in the fall. She cooked in the evenings when Reed's cook, a compact, complaining man named Hector, who was clearly counting the days until his Kansas City departure, allowed her in the kitchen, which was not always, because Hector had opinions about his domain. "You don't season things enough," she told him one evening, standing at the stove. "Nobody's died yet," Hector said. "That's a low bar." He looked at her with genuine irritation, which was progress of a kind. Men who were genuinely irritated by you were at least paying attention. Reed paid her at the end of the first week, $3. Which was what he'd said and which he handed to her in the evening without ceremony, a folded bill set on the kitchen table while she was reading. She picked it up and put it in her pocket and went back to her book. "You're not going to count it," he said. "I trust you counted it." He sat down across from her with his coffee. He did that sometimes in the evenings, not talking, just occupying the same space, which she had decided was either comfortable or companionable, and possibly both. "What are you reading?" She showed him the cover. It was a book about land law in the Oklahoma Territory, which she had found on his shelf and asked to borrow without telling him why. He looked at it for a moment. "That's not light reading." "I know." She set it on the table. "How much do you know about the homestead provisions? The section on women's property rights specifically?" "Some." "They're limited." "They are." She turned a page. "I intend to fix that, eventually." Reed looked at her across the table. In the 3 weeks she had been at Broken Creek, she had come to understand that his silences were not empty. They were the spaces where he was thinking, actually thinking, rather than just preparing his next sentence. He wasn't a man who said things before he decided they were worth saying. "You planning on staying a while then?" he said. Not exactly a question. She looked up at him. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "But it's worth knowing the law either way." The corner of his mouth moved. He picked up his coffee. And they sat there in the kitchen while the fire burned down, each of them reading, and the wind came off the ridge and rattled the window glass, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with anything. The cattle went missing on a Thursday in late November. 11 head from the north pasture, the fence cut clean, the ground churned up by horses that had come in from the east. Tom found it in the morning and came back to the house with his jaw set and his eyes flat in a way that Avery had not seen before. She was in the barn when he came through the door, and she read it on him before he said a word. "Rustlers?" she said. "Cut wire," Tom said. "Not a random grab. Somebody knew which pen." Reed was out by the time she got to the house. He came in an hour later with Charlie and Dix, and the four of them stood in the kitchen while he looked at the rough map Tom had drawn on a piece of brown paper. The fence line, the entry point, the direction the tracks ran. "How far east before the tracks go cold?" Reed said. 2 miles maybe, Charlie said. "Ground gets hard. Could have gone anywhere." Avery was standing at the edge of the group, not in it. She looked at the map. "They came from the Whitmore Range," she said. The room went quiet. She hadn't planned to say it out loud, but it was there in the geography of it. The direction, the distance, the line of the fence. "That's the east boundary. His land starts there." The men looked at her. Then they looked at Reed. Reed's face told her nothing. He picked up the map and folded it. "We don't know that," he said. His voice was even. "We don't know it isn't," she said. He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that wasn't disagreement, but wasn't agreement either. The look of a man who understood the implication and was deciding how to carry it. "I'll ride out tomorrow," he said. "Talk to the county sheriff." "Whitmore has the sheriff to dinner twice a year," Tom said. It wasn't said with heat, just fact. "I know," Reed said. "I'll still talk to him." After the others left, Avery stayed. She was washing the coffee cups at the basin, her back to the room, when Reed said, "I'm aware this may not be random." "I know you are." She set a cup on the rack. "I'm the reason he's angry." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Take the weight of it," he said. "That's not how this works. Whitmore's angry because someone told him no. That's on him." She turned around. Reed was at the table, the folded map in his hand, and he was looking at her with that direct, leveled attention that she'd come to understand was not simple. It was the look of a man who said what he meant and expected the same back, and found most conversations disappointing on that count. "If I weren't here," she said, "your cattle would be in your north pasture right now." "If you weren't here," he said, "you'd be at Whitmore's ranch. And I'd know that, and I'd have to live with it." A pause. "Not long. Just enough." "This is better than that, even with the 11 head." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the basin. "I'll fix the fence tomorrow," she said, "before the temperature drops. I'll help." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said, with the same plain patience he brought to everything. "I said I would." She didn't argue. She finished the cups and dried her hands and went to her room, and she locked the door out of habit now rather than necessity. The key a small familiar weight in her hand, and lay in the dark listening to the wind off the ridge. She had not thought about her father in 2 weeks. That surprised her when she realized it. Not the absence of thought, but the absence of guilt about the absence. She had spent so many years managing the fallout of Frank Callahan's decisions that the habit of it had become part of how she occupied her own mind, a permanent background noise she'd stopped noticing because it had always been there. The quiet where it used to be was strange, not empty, more like a room with the furniture rearranged, the same space, different to move through. She thought about the fence and the direction the tracks had run east, and Whitmore's pale, patient eyes, and the way Reed had said this is better than that without inflection or performance. Just fact, like it was obvious and he couldn't see the point in pretending otherwise. She thought about a woman who had taken 4 years to get out, about speed and choices and the difference between surviving and deciding. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind pushed at the window glass. The horses shifted in the barn. The creek ran cold and steady somewhere in the dark below the ridge, the way it had been running long before any of them arrived in this valley and would keep running long after. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that had its own particular texture. Not peaceful, exactly, because the tension of what Whitmore's cut fence represented did not go away but settled, the way things settled when people decided not to wait for trouble and got on with the work in front of them. Avery threw herself into the ranch with a focus that surprised even her. She was not performing diligence. She had simply found, for the first time in her life, that her effort went somewhere. At her father's house, work was maintenance. You held things together so they didn't fall apart, and then you did it again the next day, and the result was the same degree of barely functioning that you'd started with. Here, work added up. The fence she helped Reed repair on the north boundary stayed repaired. The cattle she helped move to the south pasture stayed moved. The broken latch on the barn door she fixed on a Tuesday was still fixed on Friday, which sounds like nothing until you've spent years watching everything come undone. She also discovered, with some surprise, that she had opinions about cattle. "These three," she said to Tom one morning, pointing out a small group of heifers standing apart from the rest of the herd in the west pasture. "They're not gaining weight like the others." Tom squinted at them. "They look all right to me." "They looked all right 2 weeks ago, too, but they're the same size now as they were then. Something's off." She climbed through the fence and walked toward the nearest one, moving slowly, reading the animal as she went. "Is there a stretch of the creek that runs shallow, east of the big cottonwood?" "There is. That's where they drink. I've watched them. The rest of the herd goes to the deep section, but these three go east." She crouched next to the heifer and looked at the grass around her feet. "Ground's marshy there. You get alkali in the soil. It gets in the water. They don't process feed the same way." Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Reed's been losing weight on heifers for 3 years in that pasture. Couldn't figure it. Move them west. Fence off the east stretch." She stood up, brushing grass from her knees. "See if it changes." Tom scratched the back of his neck. "How do you know about alkali grass?" "My mother had a kitchen garden that kept dying," Avery said. "We figured out the soil eventually." Tom looked at her with that same careful, calibrated expression he always used when she said something that exceeded what he'd been expecting. He was reordering her in his head, she knew, filing her in a different category than the one he'd put her in when she'd arrived. She didn't mind. People took time. That was just true. Reed moved the heifers that afternoon. I didn't say anything to her about it directly, but she came into the kitchen that evening to find $3 on the table beside her book. An extra week's wages, no note. She left them there for a moment, looking at them. Then she picked them up and put them in the tin she kept under the washstand in her room, where her money was accumulating slowly and deliberately, bill by bill, into something that was beginning to feel like a future rather than just a cushion. She realized, building something. She wasn't sure exactly what yet, or exactly what she wanted from it. But the building was happening, and it was hers, and the sensation of it was unlike anything she'd felt before, in not happiness, which seemed too simple a word, but something more structural. Something that felt less like a feeling and more like a foundation. She was learning what it meant to stand on ground that didn't shift every time someone else made a bad decision. She was finding out, at 22, what it felt like to work hard and keep what you'd earned and decide what to do with it. She was, in the most basic terms, finding out what she was worth. Not what anyone else had assigned her, what she actually was, tested against real work, real responsibility, real consequence. It turned out to be more than she'd been told. Oh. The second attack came before December. It wasn't cattle this time. It was the barn, or almost the barn. Charlie found it first, an hour before dawn, coming out for the early feeding. The smell of lamp oil on the east wall, a rag soaked in it pushed against the base timber, a set of boot prints in the frost leading away toward the east boundary. The rag hadn't been lit. Whether that was bad planning or a message was a question none of them had a definitive answer to. Avery stood in the frost in her coat and boots, looking at the oil-dark patch on the timber, and felt something go quiet and very cold inside her. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of escalation. Whitmore was not warning Reed. He was measuring him, testing how much a man would absorb before he moved or broke. Reed crouched next to the rag, studying it. His jaw was tight, and his eyes had the look she associated with him, thinking hard and saying little. "Dix," he said, without looking up. "Every night until I say otherwise, you and Charlie take turns watching the yard from the hayloft. Staggered hours." "Yes, sir." "Tom, I want the east fence checked every morning. First thing." Tom nodded. Reed stood up. He looked at Avery. There was something in his expression that she hadn't seen before, a strain at the edges of the composure, the look of a man who was holding something steady that was getting heavier. "You should know," he said, "that this is going to get worse before it resolves." "I know that," she said. "I'm telling you because you have the right to make a different choice if you want to." She looked at him for a long moment. The frost was bright on the grass, and the early light was just starting to come over the east ridge, cold and thin and gray. "You think I should leave?" "I think it should be your decision." "It is my decision," she said, "and I'm not leaving." She said it without heat, without drama, the way she said things that were simply true. Leaving means Whitmore wins. Not just the ranch. He wins the argument about what I'm worth and what I can decide. She looked at the oil-dark timber. "I'm not interested in conceding that argument." Reed looked at her for a long moment. His expression was complicated in a way she didn't try to fully interpret. Then he said, "All right, she said. They went inside for coffee. Hector, whose departure for Kansas City was now 2 weeks away, made it too strong, as he always did, and nobody mentioned it, as they never did. And the morning started, cold and ordinary and wary, the way mornings started when you were waiting to see what a man with patience and resources decided to do next. She drank her coffee and thought about the oil on the timber, and the tracks in the frost, and the long distance east to Whitmore's range. She thought about what kind of man planned something out that far, and executed it this carefully, the kind with nothing but time and certainty, the kind who had never once in his life been told no by someone who made it stick. She thought, well then. And she got up and went out to start the morning work. December came in hard. The first snow fell on the 3rd of the month. A serious snow that meant business from the start, not the light early season kind that melted by afternoon, but 6 inches overnight with a northwest wind that packed it against the barn wall and buried the water troughs and made every morning chore twice as long and half again as cold. The valley held the weather the way it held everything, cupped between its ridges, and what fell on Broken Creek tended to stay until it decided otherwise. Avery learned cold in a new way that month. Not the thin chill of Oklahoma flatland winters, which were uncomfortable but manageable, but the valley cold that got into the timbers of the house and settled there, that made the horses' coats go rough and thick, that turned the creek into something narrow and dark, and very fast along the center channel where it still ran while the edges glazed to ice. She learned to layer properly, to keep her hands dry before putting gloves on, to never let the barn water sit without checking it twice a day. Small knowledge, practical and immediate, the kind that didn't feel like learning until you missed one step and understood what it cost. She was not miserable. That surprised her. The absence of misery, when the conditions would have justified it. The work was hard and the days were short, and the tension of waiting for Whitmore's next move sat over the ranch like weather that hadn't fully arrived yet. But there was something about having a purpose that was genuinely hers, and a room she locked with her own key, and money in a tin under the washstand that made the hard parts feel like the price of something worth having, rather than just the general weight of a life she hadn't chosen. Tom noticed it. Not that he said anything directly. He was not a direct man when it came to anything that wasn't cattle or fence lines. But she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she'd come to recognize as something between respect and mild bewilderment. The look of a man who had revised his expectations and was still working out what to do with the revision. "You're still here," he said, one morning in mid-December, not quite to her but not to anyone else, while they were breaking ice on the West Trough. "I notice that regularly," she said. He made his grunt that meant approval. They went back to work. Reed was harder to read that month, and she'd thought she was getting reasonably good at reading him. He was quieter than usual, more interior, his attention turned inward to something he wasn't sharing. He rode out twice to see the sheriff in Caldwell Creek, the nearest town of any consequence, and came back both times with the same expression he'd left with. The sheriff, a man named Aldous Pryor, was polite and thorough, and had very little interest in pursuing cattle thefts and attempted arson against a ranch on the far side of the county, particularly when the primary suspect was Dale Whitmore, who had been a resident of that county for 22 years and was on 3 civic committees. "He said he'd look into it," Reed told her the second time. "And what does that mean, from Aldous Pryor?" Reed set his hat on the table and ran a hand through his hair, which she'd noticed he did when things were frustrating him more than he wanted to show. "It means we wait and see," he said. "That's not a strategy." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him across the kitchen table. Hector had left for Kansas City the week before, which meant she was cooking for the ranch now, which she didn't mind and was better at than she'd admitted out loud. A pot of something was on the stove behind her, doing what it needed to do. What if we documented it? She said. Everything, every incident, date, time, what was found, what direction the evidence pointed, written down and witnessed. She paused. The sheriff might be useless now, but documentation is patient. It can wait for a better sheriff, or a county judge, or a situation where Whitmore overreaches enough that even Pryor can't look the other way. Reed looked at her. That'll take time. We have time, as long as he doesn't escalate past harassment. And if he does? She held his gaze. Then we deal with what he does and document that too. There was a pause, the kind that meant he was thinking it through properly rather than just agreeing for the sake of moving on. Then, start tonight, he said. I'll witness everything you write down. She got up to check the stove. I already started, she said, 2 weeks ago. She didn't look back at him when she said it, but she felt the quality of the silence change behind her. Something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family. She had been writing down dates and details since the first fence was cut. Not because she'd had a clear plan, but because she'd learned, young, that the people who had power over you relied on you having no record of what they'd done. Her father's second wife had always been careful to leave nothing written. Whitmore had offered a paper agreement because papers could be transferred or amended or made to disappear. Information on paper, in multiple hands, witnessed and dated. That was different. That was armor of a kind. She added the barn incident to the log that evening, then the cattle theft, then 2 smaller things she'd noted. A section of water pipe that had been partially blocked with rags, which they'd thought at first was debris, and a series of tracks in the north pasture she'd documented with a rough sketch of the pattern and measurements. She dated and signed each entry. Reed countersigned. You're going to be a formidable person, he said, reading back over what she'd written. I'm already formidable, she said. I'm just documenting it. He looked up at her. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. A short, real sound, not performed, the kind that happened when something caught a person off guard. She'd heard him laugh maybe twice before, and both times it had surprised her, the way a window opening in a familiar wall surprised you. She found she liked the sound of it more than she'd expected. She went back to the log and did not make any particular note of that feeling. The escalation came on the 14th of December, and it came fast, the way things came when they'd been building for weeks, and finally decided they were done being gradual. It was 2 a.m. when Dix shouted from the hayloft. Avery woke to the sound of his voice before she understood the words. The pitch of it was enough, that particular register of controlled alarm that a young man hit when something had gone badly wrong, and he was trying to handle it without losing his composure entirely. She was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she was fully awake, and she had the rifle she'd kept by the door since the barn incident in her hand before she'd consciously decided to reach for it. The smell hit her when she opened the back door. Smoke. Not the clean wood smoke of a stove, but the thicker, dirtier smell of something burning that was not meant to burn, oily and immediate and wrong in the night air. The east side of the barn was on fire. Not all of it, not yet. A section of the wall, maybe 12 feet, the dry timber going fast in the wind, flames working their way up the siding toward the eave. Inside, the horses were making noise. She could hear them through the roar of the fire and the wind, that particular high distress sound that horses made when they could smell fire and couldn't move away from it. Get the horses out! Reed was already there, coming around the corner of the barn at a run, his coat half on. Dix, get the door! Tom! 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 Tom came from the bunkhouse at a dead run, Charlie 2 steps behind him. Avery went straight for the well and the bucket line they'd set up after the first incident. 3 buckets, a rope, the fastest way to move water they had, which was not fast enough if the fire got into the roof, but might be enough to hold the wall if they moved now. She moved. What followed was 30 minutes she would remember in pieces for a long time afterward, not as a whole sequence, but as a series of separate moments that each demanded everything and left nothing for reflection. The weight of the buckets, the heat on her face when she got close enough to throw. The horses coming out of the barn in a noise of hooves and heavy bodies, Dix holding the first one by the halter with both hands, leaning back against the animal's weight, and talking to it in a low, urgent voice. The way the fire made a sound like breathing, the smell of her own coat when she got too close, the wool scorching before she stepped back. Reed was at the wall with a wet blanket, beating at the fire where the buckets couldn't reach. and he was doing it with a kind of fierce, controlled intensity that she recognized. Not panic, just the absolute concentration of a man who understood what he stood to lose and was not yet willing to lose it. She threw another bucket and saw the fire drop back from the eave, and Tom was beside her with the next one before she'd finished reaching for it. Charlie got the secondary water barrel from behind the smokehouse. That was what turned it. The second barrel, 150 gallons, applied directly to the wall section, with focused work from all 5 of them over 20 minutes, until what had been fire was smoke, and what had been smoke was steam, and what had been a barn wall on the edge of becoming a catastrophe was 12 feet of charred, wet timber that would need replacing but was still standing. They stood in the yard afterward in the cold, all 5 of them, breathing hard. The horses were in the outer pen, unhappy and pacing, but safe. The smoke hung in the windless cold, thick and visible against the dark. Avery's hands were burned on the inside of both palms. Not badly enough to need anything more than cold water and clean cloth, but the kind of burn that would make itself known for 2 weeks. She held them at her sides and looked at the charred wall and said nothing while her breathing slowed. Reed was looking east. She looked east too. The darkness out there was complete and uninformative. Whoever had set the fire was long gone, or close enough in the dark to be the same thing. "They were here," she said. Her voice came out rough from the smoke. "I know. This wasn't a warning this time." "No." His jaw was set, the firelight from the dying embers catching the lines of his face. "It wasn't," Tom said, from behind them. "Found boot prints on the east side. Went back and checked while you were still on the wall. At least 3 men, maybe 4, coming from the east boundary." He paused. "They cut the fence to come through." "Same place?" Reed said. 50 yards north of where they cut it the first time." Avery looked at the charred wall. She looked at her burned palms, then put them behind her back. She thought about the log she'd been keeping, the dates and details, the witness signatures, 11 head of cattle, blocked pipes. Tonight's fire. 4 men through a fence line that bordered Whitmore's property. "I want a rider to Caldwell Creek at first light," she said. "Not to Pryor, to the telegraph office." Reed looked at her. "Who are you telegraphing?" "The Territorial Land Office," she said. "There's a federal marshal based in Guthrie who handles property crimes across county lines. Whitmore's operation is on the east boundary, which means if we can show the attacks are originating from his side of the fence." She stopped, because the thought was assembling itself as she said it, and she needed the rest of the space to get it right. "The county sheriff is useless, but the territorial marshal doesn't answer to county politics, and we have a documented record going back 3 weeks." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences she'd come to know from Reed. This one had weight to it. She was aware of Tom and Charlie and Dick standing behind them, aware that this was a decision that affected every person in this yard, not just the 2 of them. "That escalates things," Reed said. "Formally, officially. Once we bring federal attention to this, Whitmore will know." "He already knows everything he's doing," she said. "We're not surprising him. We're just giving him different odds." She paused. "He's counting on us absorbing this. On you deciding the cost of fighting back outweighs the cost of giving in. That's the logic of what he's doing." She looked at Reed directly. "Is he right?" Reed held her gaze for a long moment. The embers of the dying fire popped and settled behind them. "No," he said. "Then we send the telegram." Charlie went at first light. In the days that followed, while they waited for a response from Guthrie, the ranch operated under a kind of heightened alertness that was exhausting in the way sustained tension was always exhausting. Not dramatic, just present, a background current that ran through every ordinary task and made it slightly heavier. Avery redoubled the documentation. She wrote a formal account of the fire, detailed and precise, with measurements of the damaged wall section, estimated time of origin, based on when Dix had first smelled smoke, a description of the boot prints Tom had found and their direction of origin. She wrote it the way she'd taught herself to write anything important, in plain language, without editorializing, just facts in the order they happened. She added it to the log. Reed witnessed it. Tom witnessed it. She made a second copy. Reed repaired the barn wall himself, with Charlie and Dix helping. She watched them work on the 3rd morning, from the porch with a cup of coffee, noting the way the 3 of them moved around each other with the practiced ease of men who'd worked together long enough to anticipate. Tom came to stand beside her, which was unusual. Tom generally had somewhere to be. "He's going to fight this to the end," Tom said. not a question. Which one? She said. Tom looked at her sideways. Both of them, I'd say. She drank her coffee. Does that bother you? He thought about it with his characteristic seriousness. I've been at this ranch 11 years, he said. Seen 2 owners before Reed. Neither one was worth the trouble of staying. He paused. I'm still here. It was the most personal thing he'd ever said to her. She recognized it as such and didn't make anything of it, just nodded, which was the right response, and she knew it. The answer from Guthrie came 6 days after Charlie's telegram, and it came not by wire, but in person. A lean, weathered man in his mid-50s who arrived on a gray horse on a Tuesday afternoon and introduced himself as Marshal Everett Cole. He had a deputy with him, a younger man who said very little, and the economy of a man who was here to do a job and had learned that unnecessary conversation slowed everything down. Reed met him in the yard. Avery came out behind him with the log. Cole looked at the log when she handed it to him. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that she understood he was actually reading it, not just going through the performance of consulting a document. He turned pages slowly. He went back once to reread something. You wrote this? He said to Avery. I did. All of it? From the first incident. Reed countersigned everything. Tom Garrett witnessed the last 3 entries. Cole looked at Reed. The fence line bordering Whitmore's range, it's been cut twice? 3 times, Reed said. The 3rd time the night of the fire, 50 yards north of the first cut. And the boot prints your man found the night of the fire. Direction? East toward the Whitmore boundary, consistent with the cattle theft tracks in October. Cole closed the log and tapped it against his palm twice. He looked out at the east ridge, at the distance in that direction that everyone on this ranch had been thinking about for 2 months. Whitmore is a known figure in this county, he said. It wasn't a defense of the man. It was the acknowledgement of a problem. He is, Reed said. What I have here, Cole held up the log, is documentation, pattern. That's more than I usually get from property crimes in a rural district. He handed the log back to Avery. She noticed he handed it to her specifically. I'll want to speak to your men, and I'll want to ride the boundary. Today? Reed said. Daylight's running, Cole said. Yes. Cole and his deputy stayed 2 nights. In that time they rode the east boundary line, spoke to Tom and Charlie and Dix individually, examined the repaired barn wall and the section of charred timber they'd saved as evidence, and looked at the log 3 separate times. Cole asked precise questions and wrote the answers in a small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. He did not speculate, did not editorialize, did not tell them what he was going to do. He was a man who gave you the fact of his attention and kept everything else in reserve. On the 2nd evening, he sat at the kitchen table with Reed and Avery and drank coffee and said, I'm going to pay Whitmore a visit. Reed's expression didn't change. He'll say he doesn't know anything about it. He will, Cole agreed. But he'll know I've been here. He'll know what you have. He looked at the log on the table between them. Men like Whitmore work best in the dark. They're counting on no record, no witness, no one paying formal attention. He paused. That calculation changes when a federal marshal has a documented record with 20 entries and 2 witnesses and shows up at their door. Avery looked at him. You think it'll stop? I think it'll change, he said. He was careful about the word. He may not stop wanting what he wants, but the method he uses has to change when the risk changes. He picked up his coffee. We'll see what kind of man he is when the math shifts. She thought about Whitmore's patient eyes, about the certainty she'd seen in them, the deep, settled conviction of a man who had never once been told no by someone who made it stick. He doesn't change easy, she said. No, Cole agreed, but he'll calculate. He looked at her steadily. The question is whether what he calculates still points in this direction. After Cole and his deputy rode out the next morning, the ranch was quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet of the previous 2 months. Not resolved. Nothing was resolved. But the shape of the situation had shifted. They had a federal marshal with a documented record. They had a log that would survive the county politics and Aldous Pryor's dinners with Whitmore. They had, for the first time since October, something that looked less like waiting and more like preparation. Avery was in the barn in the afternoon, working with the mare that had been spooked worse by the fire and still wasn't right. The animal still flinching at sudden sounds, still running hot in confined spaces. She worked slowly, patiently, the way Tom had showed her you had to work with a horse that had been frightened badly. No sudden moves, no forcing, Just presence, consistent and undemanding, until the animal decided on its own terms that she was safe. She heard Reed come in behind her, but she didn't turn around, just kept working, running her hand slowly along the mare's neck, while the horse's ears moved back and then forward and then settled. Cole's visit won't be enough, she said, not on its own. I know. He came to stand at the stall door. Whitmore's going to try a different angle. Yes. She kept her eyes on the mare. Something that doesn't look like arson. Something harder to document. She paused. Something that comes through the law rather than around it. You're already thinking ahead of it. I've been thinking ahead of it since the barn. She turned to look at him, finally. The afternoon light in the barn was dim and dusty, and he looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before. Not defeated, nothing like that, but the kind of tired that accumulated in a person who was carrying weight and doing it properly, without passing it off. She understood the feeling. You should sleep, she said. You haven't been sleeping. He looked at her for a moment. Neither have you. I sleep fine. You're up at 4 most mornings. I wake up early. That's different from not sleeping. He leaned against the stall door. The mare looked at him and didn't move away, which was something. She'd been avoiding everyone since the fire except Avery. I want to say something, he said, and I'm going to say it plainly because I don't know another way. She waited. What you've done here, he said. The documentation, the telegraph to Guthrie, the way you handled the fire. None of that was what I asked of you. None of it was in whatever arrangement you came here under. He paused. I want you to know that I see it, what it cost, what it is. He stopped, seemed to weigh his next words against some internal standard. You could have kept your head down and let this be my problem. Most people would have. She looked at him for a long moment. The mare's breathing was slow and warm in the cold air of the barn. This is my home, she said, for as long as I decide it is. She said it quietly, without emphasis, but the word landed in the space between them with all its weight. Whitmore wants to take it away from me as much as from you, maybe more. She turned back to the mare. So no, I wasn't going to keep my head down. Reed was quiet for a moment, then, all right. She heard him push off the stall door and walk back toward the barn entrance, and she heard him pause there for a moment, and then she heard him say quietly, not asking for an answer, maybe not entirely meaning to say it out loud, I'm glad you're here, Avery. She kept her hand on the mare's neck and said nothing, but something in her chest did something complicated that she chose, for now, to leave unnamed. Outside, the December wind moved through the valley. The horses shifted in their stalls. The charred timber on the east barn wall waited for spring and new lumber, a record of what had been tried and what it held. She stayed in the barn until the light was gone, and the mare was calm, and the day had finished itself and gone wherever days went when they were through with you. Cole's visit to Whitmore's ranch produced no confession, no admission, and no immediate change that anyone could point to directly. What it produced, as the marshal had predicted, was a shift in calculation. The physical attacks stopped. January passed without a cut fence, without oil-soaked rags, without boot prints in the frost heading east. February was the same. The north pasture stayed intact. The barn wall, newly timbered by Reed and Charlie over 3 cold days in late December, stood without incident. The silence had a different texture than the silence before. It wasn't the absence of action, it was the presence of something waiting to move in a different direction. Avery didn't trust it. She kept the log running, noting dates without incident the way she'd noted dates with them, because a clean record was still a record. She kept the rifle by her door. She kept the east fence in her weekly rotation of things to check, even when there was nothing to find. Tom watched her do this without comment for 3 weeks. Then one morning, coming in from the fence check together, he said, You know it's not over. I know. Reed knows too. I know that also. Tom squinted out at the valley, the February light coming flat and white off the snow that was still on the high pasture. The question is what shape it takes next. She'd been thinking about that question since Cole had ridden out. She'd been thinking about what she knew of Whitmore, not from personal acquaintance, but from the logic of him, the pattern. He was not a man who abandoned what he wanted. He was a man who changed his method when the current one stopped working. He'd tried intimidation. He'd tried destruction. Both had produced a federal marshal with a documented file and a woman who dug in deeper rather than clearing out. So he would try something that looked nothing like intimidation or destruction. He would try something that came through the front door in daylight, with paper and process, and the respectable face of legitimate grievance. She had been waiting for it for 2 months when it finally arrived, on the 4th of March, in the form of a man named Aldrich Vane. He came in a good suit and a rented horse, which was the combination of a man who had money and was traveling somewhere he didn't consider worth bringing his own animal to. He was 40, maybe 45, with the precise grooming and careful diction of someone who had built a career out of making unfair things sound reasonable. He had a leather case under one arm and the mild professional expression of a man who did not expect to be liked and had made his peace with that. Reed met him in the yard. Avery was in the barn and heard the wagon pull in, heard the exchange of formal greetings, heard the particular careful tone that Reed used when he was being very controlled about something. She set down what she was doing and came out. Vane looked at her when she crossed the yard. His expression didn't change in any obvious way, but she caught the small recalibration. The slight adjustment of a man who had been briefed on a situation and was now revising against the actual person in front of him. "Miss Callahan," he said. He knew her name, which meant he'd been told it. "Mr. Vane." She looked at Reed. "What is this?" "I represent an interested party in a legal matter pertaining to your arrangement here," Vane said. He said it the way lawyers said things. Every word chosen for precision, and every precision chosen to be as difficult to argue with as possible. "I've come to present certain documents for Mr. Reed's consideration." "What documents?" she said. "Not Reed. Her." Vane opened his leather case. He produced a sheaf of papers, maybe 12 pages, bound with a cloth tie. He offered them to Reed. Reed took them and looked at the top page for a moment before handing them wordlessly to Avery. She read the top page, then the second. By the third, she understood the shape of it, and the coldness that moved through her had nothing to do with the March wind off the ridge. It was a legal challenge to the transfer of Frank Callahan's debt, the paper Reed had paid and taken from Whitmore back in October. The argument was technical and layered, but the core of it was this: that the original agreement between Whitmore and Frank Callahan had included a binding clause that predated Reed's purchase of the note, and that this clause constituted a prior legal claim that Reed's transaction had not properly superseded. The filing named Avery specifically as the subject of the contested arrangement, not as a party to the action, as the subject of it, as the thing in dispute. She stood in the cold yard and read 12 pages of legal language that said, in essence, that she was still owed to Dale Whitmore, and that a court needed to decide whether she could be retrieved. She did not shake. She made a specific effort not to, because Vane was watching her and she had no intention of giving him anything to read. "Who filed this?" she said. "My client prefers to remain—" "Whitmore filed it." She set the papers against her side. "Through you, so his name doesn't appear on the front page. But he filed it." Vane's expression didn't change. "The filing is a matter of public record, available at the Caldwell Creek Courthouse." "When is the hearing?" "April 17th. He paused. "Mr. Reed will of course wish to retain legal counsel. The matter is somewhat technical." She looked at him steadily. There was nothing personal in his manner. He was a professional doing a professional job, and she understood that, and it didn't make the papers in her hand any less of what they were. "Mr. Vane," she said, "I want you to understand something clearly. This action is a legal argument about a debt transfer. I am not a debt. I am not an arrangement. And I am not something a court can assign to another person regardless of how many prior claim clauses your client invented after the fact." Vane looked at her for a moment with the first genuinely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. Not surprise exactly, but the brief, involuntary recognition of a person saying something true. Then the professional surface closed back over it. "The court will make its determination, Miss Callahan. I simply served the process." "Then you've served it," she said. "You can go." He went. Ote. Reed stood in the yard after Vane's horse had cleared the gate and said nothing for a long moment. Avery was still holding the papers. She looked down at them, at the formal language and the dated clauses and her own name in the second paragraph, and she thought about her father in that kitchen turning his hat in his hands, and she thought about 22 years of having her future managed by other people's decisions. "He pivoted fast," Reed said. "He pivoted the moment Cole left," she said. "He just needed time to build the legal scaffolding." She folded the papers. "He doesn't need to win this in court. He just needs to create enough uncertainty that it's easier to give in than to fight." "I'm not giving in." She looked at him. His face was set, the jaw tight, the eyes holding something that she'd learned to recognize as his version of anger. Not hot, Not volatile, just hard and very still, the way a stone wall was still. I know that, she said, but he doesn't know you know that yet. He's waiting to see if the legal threat does what the arson didn't. Reed looked at the papers in her hand. We need a lawyer. We do. And not from Caldwell Creek. She paused. I want someone from Guthrie. Someone who doesn't know Whitmore personally and isn't at his table twice a year. That'll cost. Yes. He looked at her. You shouldn't have to pay for this. I know that. She met his eyes. I also know I have money in a tin under my washstand that I earned here, and it is mine to spend on what matters to me. And this matters to me. She paused. Don't make this about what you should provide for me. That's not what we are. Something shifted in his expression at that. Not hurt, more like a readjustment, a man reorienting against something he hadn't quite anticipated. All right, he said. I'll write to Guthrie tonight, she said. I need access to your law books, the full set. They're yours. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table with the 12 pages of Vane's filing and Reed's shelf of territorial law books, and she read for 4 hours without stopping, pulling apart the legal argument piece by piece, finding where it held weight and where it was built on assumptions that a competent challenge could dismantle. The prior claim clause was the center of it. Everything else was scaffolding. If the clause could be shown to have been added to the original Callahan agreement after the fact, or if it could be demonstrated that the clause was unenforceable under territorial law because it treated a person as property to be transferred, the whole construction collapsed. She wrote 12 pages of notes. She wrote the letter to Guthrie. She went to bed at midnight with her burned palms aching in the cold and her mind still running through the argument like a wheel that couldn't find a level surface. Reed had left the lamp on for her. She noticed that when she came through the kitchen, the lamp turned low on the table, which he never usually did, which was the kind of small particular attention that she was becoming, against her better caution, dangerously used to. She turned it out and went to her room and locked the door and lay in the dark thinking about courts and clauses and the particular satisfaction of finding the weak point in a structure that someone else had built to contain her. The lawyer from Guthrie was a woman named Clara Holt. She arrived 2 weeks after Avery's letter on a Wednesday in her own buggy, which Avery noticed and filed away as information. A woman who traveled alone to ranch country in early spring, in her own vehicle, had decided something about independence that was not reversible. She was 41, angular, with a directness that reminded Avery somewhat of herself. The same particular economy of expression that came from spending years saying things that people didn't want to hear and learning to say them anyway. Reed shook her hand in the yard, and she shook it back with the brisk competence of someone for whom the gesture was purely functional. She looked at Avery with immediate attention. You wrote the letter, she said. I did. And the incident log? Yes, I read both. She set her bag on the porch step. The log is exceptionally well documented. I've seen professional legal records with less precision. She paused. The filing from Vane is aggressive but not solid. The prior claim clause is the whole argument and it has problems. She looked at Reed. May I use your kitchen table and several hours of your daylight? It's yours, Reed said. The three of them sat at the kitchen table for 5 hours that first afternoon. Clara Holt worked through the filing the way Avery had, methodically, finding the weight-bearing walls and testing each one. She asked precise questions and wrote the answers in her own notebook without comment, and when she had what she needed, she leaned back in her chair and said, This clause was not in the original agreement. How do you know? Reed said. Because the language style is different from the rest of the document. The original debt agreement uses common frontier contract language, plain, informal, standard. The prior claim clause uses legal terminology that you don't see in informal contracts. It was added later by someone with legal training. She tapped the papers. Vane's own work, most likely, retrofitted to an original document that was simpler. She paused. Which means the original document can be obtained and compared. Your copy of the transfer note, do you have it? Reed went to his office. He came back with the document that had been on the kitchen table on that October afternoon when Avery had read it twice and known which line to question. Clara Holt looked at it for 2 minutes without speaking. The original Callahan-Whitmore agreement is referenced here, she said. Reed's purchase superseded it in full. There is no reservation clause, no prior claim mentioned, nothing that could have given Whitmore any retained interest. She set it down. Whitmore's filing depends on a clause that didn't exist when Reed bought the note. He fabricated the legal basis after the fact. The kitchen was quiet. Can you prove it? Avery said. The document comparison is strong circumstantial evidence. The style analysis alone should give a judge serious pause. Clara looked at her. But the strongest element of your case is you. She paused. Not the paperwork, you. Meaning what exactly? Meaning the argument at the core of this filing, regardless of the prior claim language, is that a woman can be transferred between men as part of a debt settlement. That is the actual claim being made here, dressed up in contract language. Clara's voice was matter of fact. Not outraged, just clear. A territorial court in 1890 should not be able to sustain that argument. It shouldn't have been sustainable 10 years ago, but it requires someone to stand up and say so directly. She held Avery's gaze. You would need to testify. Avery looked at her hands, flat on the table. The burns from the fire had healed, mostly. Pink new skin where the blisters had been. The texture slightly different from the skin around it. Evidence of something survived. Tell me what that looks like, she said. It looks like standing in a courtroom in Caldwell Creek and telling a judge and a full gallery exactly who you are and what you chose and why no paper in existence supersedes that choice. Clara paused. It also looks like Whitmore's lawyer trying to make you seem unreliable, unstable, or beholden to Reed's interests rather than your own. You would need to be steady. I can be steady, Avery said. Clara looked at her for a moment with an expression that was close to the expression Tom used when he revised his expectations. Yes, she said. I think you probably can. The weeks before the April 17th hearing had their own particular quality. Not quite dread, not quite anticipation, but something that lived in the narrow space between them. The ranch work continued because it had to, and because work was the thing. Avery had always used to keep herself from being consumed by what she couldn't control yet. She and Clara met 3 more times, 2 by correspondence, and once when Clara made the trip back from Guthrie in early April, and each meeting refined the strategy a degree further. They had the document comparison, the incident log, Marshall Cole's filed report, and Avery's testimony. It was a strong case. It was not a guaranteed case because no case was guaranteed when the name of one party was known to the judge, and the name of the other party was a 22-year-old ranch hand from out of county. Reed did not try to shield her from any of it. That mattered more than she'd expected it to. He didn't suggest that Clara handle the testimony differently, or that Avery let him take more of the public-facing part of the argument, or that perhaps it would be cleaner if she were less visibly central to it. He treated it the way he treated everything she did on the ranch, as her territory, her judgment, her call. He was present and he was useful, and he stayed in his own lane. One evening, 2 weeks before the hearing, she found him on the porch after dinner, looking out at the valley. She came and stood beside him. The spring was coming in properly now. The cottonwoods along the creek were greening up, the days longer and warmer, the high pasture losing its snow inch by inch to reveal the pale, matted grass that would come back in a few weeks. The valley in the early dark was quiet, in the specific way it was quiet in spring, alive and returning, full of small sounds that hadn't been there in the cold. I want to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. If we lose the hearing. She said it plainly, because she had learned by now that he preferred directness to careful phrasing. What does that actually mean, legally? He was quiet for a moment. Clara thinks it's unlikely. I know what Clara thinks. I'm asking what it means. He looked at the valley. If the court sustains Whitmore's claim, it creates a legal obligation under the original debt agreement, which Whitmore would use to argue your transfer to him. He paused. But a court ruling isn't a physical action. It creates a legal instrument. It doesn't move you anywhere. Unless Whitmore uses it to compel, he can't compel you to go anywhere, not physically, not legally, in any framework I understand. His voice was very level. What he could do is create enough legal pressure to make staying here untenable for both of us. Ongoing litigation, injunctions, making the ranch impossible to operate. She thought about that. The stars were coming out over the east ridge, the first ones, cold and high. Would you sell? She said. If it came to that. He turned and looked at her. The expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Not complicated, but deep, the way still water was deep. No, he said, I wouldn't sell. Even if it cost you everything. Even then. She looked back at the valley. That's a heavy position to take for someone else's fight. It stopped being someone else's fight a while ago, he said. He said it the same way he said most things, without performance, without angling for a reaction, just fact, plainly stated. She stood with that for a long moment. The creek was audible in the silence, running fast with the snowmelt, pushing against its banks. The cottonwoods moved slightly in the night air. I'm going to win this hearing, she said. I know, not because the law is necessarily fair, because I'm going to make the argument that's harder to ignore than it is to agree with. Clara said the same thing, he said. Different words. Clara's smart. So are you. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the valley again, his hands on the porch rail, his face quiet and steady in the dark. She thought about the kitchen table in October, and the document with her name on it, and the key on the washstand, and the burned palms and the log she'd been keeping since the third week of November. She thought about what it meant to build something out of a direction and a tin full of wages, and the specific, unglamorous work of paying attention. She thought about what it meant to stand somewhere and call it home, and mean it without flinching. Read, she said. After the hearing. She stopped, started again. I want to talk about what happens after, what this looks like, going forward. She was picking her words with unusual care, which she noticed, and which he would notice too. Not the ranch, us. He turned and looked at her fully then. Whatever he found in her face, he held it for a moment before he said anything, and when he spoke his voice was quiet and unhurried. I'd like that, he said. The talking. Just the talking? The edge of a smile. To start with. She turned back to the valley and let out a slow breath. Something in her chest had been tight for a long time. Not since October, not since the fire, but longer than that, years longer. The tension of a person who had never once allowed herself to want something without already planning for the loss of it. The breath let some of that go. Not all of it, but some. April 17th first, she said. April 17th first, he agreed. They stood on the porch, while the dark finished settling over the valley, and the stars multiplied, and the creek ran its cold, purposeful course in the dark below. Neither of them went in for a long time. There was no particular reason to hurry. The morning of the hearing, Avery woke before 4. She lay in the dark and went through the testimony in her head, not word for word, because she wasn't going to recite it, but the shape of it, the argument's spine, the document comparison, the incident log, the nature of what Whitmore was actually claiming, stripped of its contract language. The question of whether a territorial court in 1890 was going to look a 22-year-old woman in the face and tell her that a paper her father signed decided her future. She got up. She dressed in the clothes she'd set out the night before. Not her ranch clothes, but the good dress she'd had since before Broken Creek, dark blue wool, worn at the cuffs, but clean and pressed. She braided her hair the way her mother used to, pinned close, nothing loose. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and saw a woman she recognized and was not entirely displeased with. She picked up the incident log from the table. She picked up the copy of the original transfer note Clara had marked with tabs. She put them in the bag she'd prepared the night before. She unlocked her door and went to the kitchen. Reed was already up. Coffee on the stove, 2 cups out, bread cut and set on a plate. He looked at her when she came in and something moved in his expression. Not sentiment, or not only that. More like the look of a man who has decided something and is comfortable with the decision. Ready? He said. She poured her coffee. She looked at the kitchen, the stove, the table, the window that faced east and let in the first gray light of an April morning. She looked at all of it as if she were memorizing it, or as if she were seeing it for the first time, or both. Yes, she said. They went. The Caldwell Creek Courthouse was a 2-story brick building on the main street that smelled of old wood and lamp oil and the particular dry staleness of rooms where important things were decided by people who would rather not be bothered. It had been built in 1882, which meant it was 8 years old and already looked 20, because frontier construction aged the way frontier people aged, faster than the calendar suggested, shaped by conditions that showed no particular interest in preservation. Avery had never been inside it before. She walked through the front door behind Clara Holt and beside Reed, and took in the gallery with a single sweep before she let herself look at anything else. The room was nearly full. That surprised her. Not that people had come, because a legal action involving Dale Whitmore and a disputed debt arrangement was exactly the kind of thing that drew a county's attention. But the number of them, packed into the wooden benches with the suppressed energy of people who understood that what was about to happen was not routine. She recognized some faces. Tom was there, which she hadn't expected. He'd ridden in that morning without telling anyone he was coming, and was seated in the third row with his hat in his hands and his expression set to its default careful neutral. Charlie was beside him. Even Dix had come, sitting at the end of the bench with his coat too big for him and his young face trying hard to project a gravity it hadn't quite grown into yet. Marshal Cole was in the back row. She saw him when she turned to take her seat at Clara's table. He caught her eye and gave her a single small nod, the kind that meant he was there as a fact and not just as a witness. Whitmore was already seated at the opposing table with Vane. He was dressed well, his gray hair combed back, his posture the posture of a man who was accustomed to rooms like this working in his favor. He did not look at Avery when she came in. That was deliberate, she knew. The particular studied indifference of someone who wants you to know you're beneath their notice, and wants the room to see that they want you to know it. She looked at him steadily for a moment, long enough to mark his position, and then turned to her table and set down her bag. The judge was a man named Harlan Briggs, 60 years old, with a face that gave nothing away, and eyes that moved over the room with the slow, calibrated attention of a man who had presided over enough proceedings to know where the theater was and where the substance was, and had developed a strong preference for the latter. He came in without ceremony, took his seat, and looked at the room the way a carpenter looked at a piece of wood before deciding what it needed. "We're here on the matter of Whitmore versus Reed," he said. His voice was dry and level. "Pertaining to a contested debt agreement and the validity of a transfer document dated October of last year." He looked at Clara. He looked at Vane. "We'll hear the plaintiff's argument first, Mr. Vane." Vane stood. "I was good." Avery granted him that because she believed in knowing your opposition accurately. He built the prior claim argument with precision, framing it as a straightforward contract dispute. The original Callahan-Whitmore agreement had contained a binding clause that predated Reed's purchase of the note, and Reed's transaction had therefore superseded nothing because there was nothing available to supersede. He kept the language technical, kept Whitmore's name at the center of the legitimate grievance, and kept Avery's name at the margins, referring to her as the party in question rather than by name, which she understood was deliberate, making her a thing in the document rather than a person in the room. He spoke for 40 minutes. When he sat down, the room was quiet, with the particular quality of people who have been following something carefully and are not yet sure what to do with it. Clara rose, so began with the document comparison. She had obtained the original Callahan-Whitmore agreement from the county records office, a right she was entitled to as counsel of record, and she laid both documents on the judge's bench side by side and walked through the language difference with the patient. Methodical clarity of a woman who understood that making a complicated thing comprehensible was itself a form of persuasion. The prior claim clause. Its terminology. The formal legal construction that did not appear in any other line of the original agreement. The language of this clause, Clara said, was not part of the original transaction. It was introduced into the record after the fact, by a party who recognized that the transaction Reed executed had legally closed his claim and was attempting to construct a retroactive basis for reopening it. She paused. The court can verify this through the original filed record at the county office, which shows no prior claim language in the stamped copy held on record at the time of filing. Briggs looked at the two documents. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at Vane. "Is counsel prepared to address the discrepancy in document language?" Vane stood. "The original agreement was a private document, Your Honor, and the county copy may not reflect all." "The county copy is the legal record," Briggs said. "That is what makes it the county copy." He set the documents down. His tone had not changed. It had simply become more level, which in a judge was a different thing from more friendly. He looked at Clara. "You indicated the plaintiff intends to call a witness." "The defense does, Your Honor, Miss Avery Callahan." The room stirred. She had thought about this moment many times over the past 3 weeks. She had thought about it practically. What she would say, in what order, which points were weight-bearing and which were secondary. She had thought about it less practically, too, in the dark of her room in the hours before 4, when she woke and lay still and felt the weight of it. The possibility of being told, in a public room, by a person with legal authority, that the paper her father had signed still had a claim on her future. That she had never, in any meaningful sense, gotten out, She walked to the witness stand with her back straight and her chin level, which Reed had once told her he'd noticed on the day they met, and which she chose now not as performance, but because it was how she moved when she had decided something. She settled into the chair. She looked at the room once, Tom's careful face, Charlie, Dick's, Reed at the defense table with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes on her. And then she looked at Clara and waited. Clara led her through it carefully. The circumstances of October. Her father's debt and Whitmore's arrangement, Reed's offer and what it had included, wages, independence, a room with a lock whose only key was hers, her work at the ranch, the money she had saved, the incident log she had kept and the choice she had made to stay through the attacks, because the ranch had become hers in the way that any place became yours when you worked it and improved it and defended it. She answered each question directly, without elaborating beyond what was asked, without performing distress or composure. She had learned, from her mother and from years of managing her father's household, that the most powerful way to say a difficult thing was to say it in a voice that did not apologize for saying it. Then Vane stood for cross-examination. He was careful about it because he was smart enough to know that the wrong approach to a woman on a witness stand in a packed gallery would turn the room against him faster than any argument could turn it back. He went for legitimacy instead. He questioned whether her wages constituted real employment or a form of compensation designed to create a legal fiction. He questioned whether her presence at the ranch was truly voluntary or whether her options had been so limited that Reed's offer constituted a different kind of coercion. He questioned whether a woman in her position could reasonably be considered an independent party to any legal matter, given the circumstances of her arrival. I was trying to make her small, not cruelly, professionally, which was, in its way, worse. She let him finish his last question. She sat for a moment in the quiet after it. "Mr. Vane," she said, "you've spent the last 10 minutes suggesting that because my options were limited, my choices weren't real, that because I was desperate, my decisions don't count." She kept her voice even, not angry, just clear. "Every woman in this territory makes decisions under constraint. Every person without money or land makes decisions under constraint. If limited options invalidated choice, there would be no such thing as consent for anyone who wasn't already free." She paused. "I chose to leave my father's house. I chose to take Reed's offer over Whitmore's arrangement. I chose to stay when Whitmore's men cut the fences and set the fire. I chose to document every incident and contact a federal marshal and retain legal counsel." She looked at him steadily. "Which of those choices would you like to argue I didn't actually make?" The room was very quiet. Vane had no follow-up question. He sat down. Judge Briggs looked at Avery for a moment with an expression that was not exactly warm but was the opposite of dismissive. He looked at his papers. He looked at the 2 documents still on his bench. He looked at Whitmore, who was looking at the table in front of him with the flat, compressed expression of a man who has watched his careful construction come apart in a room full of people and is now doing the arithmetic of what that costs him. "I'll consider my ruling," Briggs said. 30 minutes. 30 minutes in the courtroom anteroom was a particular kind of time, pressured and elastic simultaneously, moving too fast and not fast enough. Clara was calm in the way professionals were calm before rulings, not confident, but composed, which was different. Reed stood by the window. Tom and Charlie and Dix had come out into the hallway and were standing the way people stood when they didn't know what to do with their hands. Avery sat on the wooden bench along the wall and looked at the floor and thought about nothing deliberate. She had said what she'd come to say. It was out of her hands now in the most literal sense, and she had always been bad at the part of things that was out of her hands. But she was getting better at it, slowly, the way you got better at things that were mostly a matter of practice. Reed came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, close enough that she could feel the solid fact of him, and that was sufficient. After a while she said quietly, "My father used to say his luck was about to change." Reed looked at her. "He believed it every time," she said. "Right up until the end. I used to think that was weakness, that believing in something that kept failing you was a character defect." She paused. "I don't think that anymore." "What do you think now?" "I think hope is just belief in a direction. It's not about the outcome. It's about the fact that you kept orienting towards something rather than accepting wherever you'd landed." She looked at her hands. The new skin on her palms, where the burns had healed, was smooth and slightly different in texture from the rest. He had bad luck because he made bad choices. But the hoping itself wasn't the problem. She stopped. I've been hoping for things since I was 7 years old. I just didn't know it yet. Reed looked at her for a long moment with that steady, undemanding attention of his, the kind that never asked her to be different from what she was. What were you hoping for at 7? She almost smiled. Ground that didn't move every time someone else made a bad decision. He was quiet. Then, is it solid enough? The ground here? She looked at him. Question was not a small one, and they both knew it. Yes, she said. It is. And then, because she was not a person who said things she didn't mean, you helped make it that way. Before he could respond, Clara appeared at the anteroom door. Briggs is back, she said. Whoa. The room was standing room when they returned. Avery took her seat and looked straight ahead. Judge Briggs settled into his chair and set his papers on the bench, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who was going to say what he was going to say and had no interest in either suspense or theater. He looked at the room for a moment. The plaintiff's claim rests entirely on a prior claim clause whose presence in the original agreement is not supported by the county's filed copy of that document, he said. The defense has provided compelling evidence that this clause was introduced to the record after the fact. I find the plaintiff's foundational argument unsubstantiated. He paused. The transfer executed by Silas Reed in October of last year was legally complete and superseded any prior claim. The plaintiff's filing is dismissed. A sound moved through the gallery. Not a cheer, not exactly. More like the collective release of something that had been held. Tom's expression shifted 1 degree. Dix forgot himself and exhaled audibly enough that Charlie elbowed him. Briggs was not done. He set down his papers and looked out over the room with the expression of a man who has decided to say one more thing and is going to say it whether the procedure strictly requires it or not. I want to note for the record, he said, that this action attempted to use the legal process to determine the disposition of a free adult woman as though she were an asset in a debt agreement. Whatever language was employed to dress that argument, that is what it was. He looked at Whitmore directly. This court will not be used for that purpose again. Any future filing of this nature, from any party, will be referred immediately to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review. He looked down at his papers. We're adjourned. The gavel came down. Whitmore left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Vane packed his leather case with the efficient composure of a professional who understood that outcomes were not personal and followed his client out. The room began to empty in the particular way rooms emptied after something important, slowly, with people pausing to speak to each other in the subdued tones of people who were still processing what they'd witnessed. Marshal Cole found Avery in the doorway. He shook her hand, which she accepted, and said, "Well documented, Miss Callahan." "Thank you for coming," she said. "I had an interest in the outcome," he said. He glanced toward the door that Whitmore had gone through. "He's not done wanting things, but he's going to want them more quietly from here." He paused. "Men like that don't change. They just calculate." "I know. So do you," he said, with something in his voice that was close to respect. He put his hat on and went. Clara was already by the door, speaking with a man Avery didn't recognize, another attorney, from the look of the suit and the way they were talking, the rapid professional shorthand of colleagues. Avery watched her and thought about a woman who drove her own buggy across open territory and walked into a courtroom and dismantled a fabricated legal argument in front of a packed gallery, and she thought, I want to know more about how to do that. She added it to the list of things she intended to learn. Reed was beside her when she turned. He hadn't said anything since the ruling, which was exactly like him, giving the moment its space, not filling it with noise. She looked at his face and found there what she'd come to rely on finding there. Steadiness, and the specific warmth of a person who was genuinely glad about something and wasn't performing it. "It's over," she said. "This part is," he said. She nodded. The distinction mattered, and she knew it. Whitmore would recalculate. The territory was large and the law was inconsistent, and men with money and patience found ways. But this part, the specific legal threat, the attempt to use a paper to erase the choices she'd made, was over. That was enough for today. Tom appeared at her elbow. He was holding his hat in both hands, the way he always did when he was feeling something he wasn't sure how to carry. He looked at the floor, then at her, then at the floor again. "Good testimony," he said. For Tom, that was a speech. "Thank you," she said, "for being here." Hemod his grunt. He put his hat on. He went to find Charlie and Dix, and the three of them moved toward the door, the way men moved when they'd witnessed something that meant something and weren't going to talk about it directly. Spring came to Broken Creek Valley with the deliberate, unannounced arrival that spring always used. Not one morning where everything changed, but a gradual accumulation of days, each one a degree warmer and a degree longer than the last, until you looked up one afternoon and the cottonwoods were fully green, and the creek was running high and clear with the snowmelt, and the kitchen garden fence Avery had repaired in March was beginning to show the first evidence that what she'd planted in it was going to come up. She had started with beans because beans were reliable and she understood them. Then squash, along the south-facing wall where the sun banked warmth into the stone. Then tomatoes near the house wall, close enough to catch the heat that bled through the stone in the afternoon, the way Hector had told her he'd grown them before he'd let the garden go to ruin. She didn't know yet how the valley's particular soil and light would affect any of it. She was learning a new piece of ground, and ground took time. The heifers. She'd moved from the alkali section of the east pasture were gaining weight for the first time in 3 years. She and Reed had ridden the South Range together in April and found 3 more sections of fence that needed work, and a water source on the high pasture that she thought could be developed into a reliable summer watering point for the herd if they ran pipe from the spring above the North Ridge. Reed had listened to her assessment, and then they'd ridden up to look at the spring together, and he'd said, "I've been looking at this ridge for 6 years and not seen that." She'd said, "You weren't looking at the water table. You were looking at the grass." He'd said, "Yes." And they'd stood on the ridge and looked down at the valley, and she had felt, in that moment, the particular satisfaction of understanding a place well enough to see what it needed. She was learning what she was good at. That sounds simple. It wasn't. It required first the opportunity to find out, to try things and fail at some of them and succeed at others without someone else managing the outcome for her. It required ground that held still long enough for her to take stock of herself. She had not had that before. She was having it now, and it was changing the shape of who she understood herself to be, which was the most disorienting and necessary change a person could go through. She was not the girl who had stood in her father's kitchen and understood what she was worth to the people who were supposed to love her. That was still in her. That knowledge did not leave you, once you'd had it, but it was no longer the thing at the center. It had moved to the edges, the way old damage did when new structure grew up around it. It was part of her history, not the whole of her architecture. She wrote to Clara Holt in May, asking about reading law. Not to become an attorney. The territory's provisions for that were complicated and the path was long. But to understand it better. To be harder to maneuver with paper and process. To know what she knew when she sat across from men like Vane and saw the seams in their arguments. Clara wrote back in 10 days with 3 books and a list of cases she thought Avery should read, and a note at the bottom that said, "There are women doing this work. It's slow and it's difficult and it matters. Keep in touch." She kept the note. She added it to the folder with her birth certificate and the letter from the school teacher in Muskogee who had once told her she was smart and ought to find a way to use it. She and Reed had their conversation, the one she'd named on the porch in March, the one he'd said he was willing to have. They had it in pieces over weeks, because neither of them was built for the kind of declaration that happened in a single concentrated moment. It wasn't dramatic. It was not the stuff of novels, or if it was the kind of novel that was more interested in what things actually felt like than in how they were supposed to look. What they were, in practice, was 2 people who had come to rely on each other in ways that had started as practical and had become something more structurally important than either of them had planned for. She trusted his judgment on things she'd watched him judge. He trusted hers on things she'd demonstrated she could assess. They worked well together, which was not a romantic statement but was, in her experience, rarer and more durable than most romantic ones. She did not love him the way she'd imagined loving someone would feel, back when she was young enough to imagine it in broad, clear colors. It was nothing like that. It was more like the feeling of the kitchen in the morning, with the stove going and the light coming east through the window. Not spectacular, not arrived at dramatically, just deeply, specifically right. The kind of right that came from actual fit rather than aspiration. She told him something close to this one evening, and he had looked at her for a moment and said, "That might be the most practical description of love I've ever heard. Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's probably the most accurate one." She considered that. Were you expecting something different? I stopped expecting specific things a while ago, he said. It makes the actual things easier to see. She thought about her father, who had spent his whole life expecting his luck to change and never managed to see clearly what was actually in front of him. She thought about how expectation could be a form of blindness, how the idea of what something should be could make you miss what it actually was. She thought about a girl who'd arrived at a valley with $12 in her coat lining and a folder of documents and the specific unfancy resilience of someone who had been surviving on nothing but herself for long enough that she'd gotten good at it. She thought about what that girl had become by doing the work in front of her every day and refusing to let anyone else decide what it added up to. I want to make something formal, she said. The partnership, the ranch. She looked at him. I want my name on the deed. Reed looked at her steadily. It should have been there from the beginning, he said. Don't, she said. Don't make it a thing you're giving me. I want to earn the stake. I have savings. We draw up a fair agreement with Clara. Equal contribution, equal ownership. She paused. I don't want to be given things. I want to build them. He was quiet for a long moment, not hesitating, thinking it through properly, which she knew by now was what his silences meant. All right, he said. We'll write to Clara. Good. And Avery. She looked at him. The other thing, between us. He was choosing his words with the care he brought to things that mattered. I'm not in a hurry. I'm not going anywhere. But I want you to know that what I said on the porch, about it not being someone else's fight anymore, that wasn't about the ranch. He held her gaze. It was about you. She held that for a moment. Let it settle where it needed to settle. I know, she said. I knew then. You didn't say anything. I needed to get through April 17th first, the edge of a smile. And now? She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the house that was becoming hers, in the way that places became yours when you'd defended them and worked them and put your own particular intelligence into every problem they'd offered you. She looked at him, this steady, complicated, imperfect man who had moved faster than he had once before because he understood what it cost to be too slow. Now, she said, I think we have time. Broken Creek Valley changed over the years, the way all places changed. Not all at once, and not always in the direction you'd planned, but with the cumulative direction of a great many small good decisions made by people who were paying attention. The herd grew. The high pasture water source Avery had identified became a reliable summer resource and reduced winter feed costs substantially in the second year. The kitchen garden expanded to twice its original size, and then again, and she learned the soil the way she'd promised herself she would. By failure first, then by adjustment, then by the particular satisfaction of competence that arrived not as a single moment, but as an accumulation of seasons. The fence on the north boundary that Tom had said needed replacing before spring was replaced in the second spring and held through 6 winters without incident. Tom retired when he was 58 to a small house in Caldwell Creek, where he kept a kitchen garden of his own. He came back to the valley twice a year, in spring and fall, and walked the fence lines and looked at the cattle and ate supper at the kitchen table and said very little and noticed everything, which was exactly like him. Dix became a good hand and then a better one. He managed the North Range independently by the time he was 25, and Avery trusted his judgment on the high pasture because she'd trained him to see the things she saw. She and Reed were married in a simple ceremony in Caldwell Creek in the fall of that first year, with Clara Holt as witness, and Tom and Charlie standing in their best coats looking uncomfortable and present. There was no particular ceremony about it. It was a decision made by 2 people who had already decided it in the ways that actually mattered, and this was just the paperwork. Her name went on the deed that same month. Avery Reed, co-owner, Broken Creek Ranch, Broken Creek Valley, Oklahoma Territory. She kept the document in her folder alongside her birth certificate and the school teacher's letter and the incident log and the legal books and the letter from Clara about women doing this work. She kept everything. She had learned early that the things written down were the things that could be returned to, and she was a person who believed in knowing your own history clearly enough to choose where you went from it. So, Whitmore lost his ranch in 1893 to an overextended credit position that the drought had made untenable. He left the county quietly, the way people left when things were finished, and Avery did not hear where he went. She thought about him less than she would have expected, given everything. Not with forgiveness, exactly, because there were things that didn't require forgiveness, so much as they required being left in the past where they belonged. What he had done had been real. She carried no obligation to diminish it, but she carried no obligation to carry it either. Her father died in 1894 of the things that killed men who lived like Frank Callahan, the accumulated toll of bad decisions and cheap whiskey, and the particular loneliness of a man who had burned through everyone who might have stayed. She went to the funeral. She stood at the grave and thought about a man who had always believed his luck was about to change, who had spent a lifetime waiting for the cards to reward him and died still waiting. She thought about the hat turning in his hands. She thought about the girl standing in that kitchen, understanding what she was worth to him. She thought, "You were not a bad man. You were a man who could not see past the next hand. That was a failure of vision, not of heart, and it cost both of you more than it should have." She did not cry. She went home to the valley, and the cottonwoods were in their spring green, and the creek was running fast and cold with the melt, and the tomatoes near the house wall were 2 weeks from the first harvest, and she stood on the porch and looked at all of it, and understood, in the most complete way she'd yet understood it, what it meant to have built something that was entirely, irrevocably, no document necessary, hers. There is a particular kind of freedom that you cannot be given. It cannot be purchased on your behalf, or provided as part of an arrangement, or granted by a judge's ruling, though all of those things help with the specific obstacles in the way of it. It is the freedom that comes from knowing your own worth, not as something assigned by other people's appraisals, but as something tested and demonstrated and recognized by yourself through actual hard work in actual difficult conditions. Avery Callahan, Avery Reed, found that freedom, the way most worthwhile things are found, gradually, incompletely, through a series of choices that didn't always look like progress from inside them. She found it in 12 pages of incident log written by lamplight after everyone else was asleep. She found it in her own voice in a packed courtroom saying, plainly and without apology, "Which of those choices would you like to argue I didn't actually make?" She found it in a kitchen garden that kept failing until she figured out the soil. She found it in the weight of a tin full of wages that were hers because she had earned them, spent on what mattered to her because she was the one who decided what mattered. She found it in the understanding that love, real love, the kind that survived a winter and a fire and a legal challenge and the ordinary grinding work of two imperfect people building a life together, was not a rescue. It was a witness. It was a person who saw you clearly and chose to stand next to you while you became who you were going to be, without trying to manage the outcome. That was what Reed had given her. Not safety, not money, not rescue from her circumstances. He had given her a room with a lock whose only key was hers, and wages for work she actually did, and the particular respect of a man who looked at her and saw a person making real choices rather than a problem to be solved. She had done everything else herself. That is the thing worth saying. Not because it diminishes what he offered, it doesn't, but because the story of a woman who is saved by a man is an old story, told so many times it has worn grooves in the way we think about what women are capable of. The truth of Avery's story was different. She was not saved. She was given ground that held still, and on that ground she built something from the foundation up, stone by stone, season by season, with her own hands and her own judgment, and the specific hard-won knowledge of a woman who had survived being worth nothing to the people who should have valued her, and decided, on her own authority, to reassess the appraisal. She was in the end the most valuable thing in Broken Creek Valley. Not because anyone told her so, because she knew it, and she had earned the knowing.